virtual events and our to-go menu. And finally, with our in-dining options, our in-club dining options, which we've been able to open up for lunch just this past week. So we hope to see you around the club. And next week, we're going to have our first actual in-person event through the membership committee, meeting new members. So if you're available, would like to attend, please contact Nancy Sloan. So tonight's event is a part of a 2-event series that the Advisory Council has put together to help commemorate the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted suffrage, or the right to vote, to women. And as we were looking for ideas for the events, I was doing some research, and I discovered, I did the research about the stories, and I discovered a very different story about granting women the right to vote. And I also discovered 2 things. One, that there was a very different story for women of color. And number 2, that there was actually a Baltimore connection, and that there were suffragettes in Baltimore at the time. So I thought that it would be interesting for us to explore these stories of the women in Baltimore who were involved in the suffrage movement and who were leaders, and also to explore the very different story of the women of color who were involved in the suffrage movement, but didn't necessarily earn the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So we'll talk about why that happened and who were the leaders and the founders of the movement, a very separate movement for women of color, and why that evolved. So tonight we have, we're having a conversation with our panel members, and our panel members are people who have explored this topic and researched it. And our first panelist is Dr. Martha Jones, and she's professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, and she has written a book called Vanguard, which actually explores the topic of Black women in the vote. Jean Thompson has had a separate journey, and her journey has led her to similar stories and to explore what happened in the movement in the state of Maryland and in Baltimore locally. And last but not least, we have Savannah Wood. And Savannah is an editor, and she actually curated a number of documents and articles and provenance, really, that supports the movement that happened in Baltimore. And most of these are taken from the archives of the Afro-American newspaper. And she is involved with the foundation. So I'm going to let them talk to you and introduce themselves to you. And then we'll start with the discussion or the conversation around the suffrage movement and these stories of these amazing women. So Martha, if you would just like to take 3 minutes, we're going to cut it a little short, 3 minutes, and you can give us your official and unofficial bio.
Sure. Well, first, let me say thank you to you, Denise, and thank you to everyone at the Center Club for bringing us together. It's an honor to be here with Savannah and with Jean and be part of this conversation. As Denise said, I've just yesterday published a book called Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. And what I hope to bring to the conversation is to some degree, a bird's eye perspective on the history of the 19th Amendment as told from the perspective of Black American women. Some people have asked me, am I celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment? And I explain that it's a difficult moment for thinking about celebration from the perspective of the women that I write about. Too many of them remain untouched by the 19th Amendment, the spirit of the 19th Amendment, which should have prohibited the states from keeping women from the polls. The 19th Amendment allowed individual states to use their own laws, as well as intimidation and violence, to keep Black women from the polls, despite a federal amendment. So Vanguard is a story about, in essence, how Black women are required at every turn to build their own movement for political rights, how they grapple with the challenges of racism, but more importantly, how they take hold of the project of building their own movement for voting rights. And so while conventional histories of the 19th Amendment might finish in 1920 with the transformation of the Constitution, my history, importantly, continues until 1965 and passage in that year of the Voting Rights Act. There, in the midst of the modern civil rights movement, African-American women, along with African-American men, are finally able to forcefully set aside poll taxes and literacy tests and more that had long kept them from the polls, and really usher in a new era of American politics for Black Americans, including women. I hope we'll at some point during the Q&A get to talk about the ways in which since 1965, Black women have really built themselves into a force in American politics. If I had written a book that very much dwells on lots of firsts, I think here in 2020, we sit in the midst of a sea change in which Black women are a force in American politics, hardly represented only by singular individuals, but really by a collective capacity to shape the agenda, to shape the ticket, and to shape the outcome on election day. So again, thank you again for inviting me to be a part of the conversation. I really look forward to it.
Thank you, Martha. And we're just so excited to have you share with us. Jean.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, thank you to the Center Club and to the Viewpoints program and my distinguished panelists and all of you for coming. I started my road into research of the 19th Amendment and voting rights about 30 years ago as a collector. I'm not a PhD. I am a trained journalist and researcher, and I worked for 17 years for the Baltimore Sun and then at the New York Times after that. And so I've chosen to use my research ability to most recently volunteer with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And many of you will be familiar with that. That's the source of the contributor to the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame. And about 6 months ago, we took on a project of trying to look at primary documents here in Maryland and in Baltimore to identify women who were suffragists all across the state, from Garrett County to down to Dorchester, up to Cecil County, and right here in the city. So far, we have documented approximately 55 women, and we know there were more. But the story of women in Maryland involved in the suffrage movement is a story often of that's forgotten, and the story of African American women in suffrage is even more forgotten, and is only beginning to come to light, largely through the work of wonderful researchers. The late Dr. Rosalind Turbo Penn at Morgan State University has written sort of the Bible on which we all build our work about African American women in the vote. But from there, moving forward, we've gained an understanding that for Black women in Maryland and in Baltimore, obtaining the vote was not a singular pursuit. It was not, the goal in it and of itself was not necessarily getting the vote for women, but it was part of a larger mission to improve their lives, to battle segregation, to overcome the setbacks that racism had placed on them, to improve education for their children, their civic goals, their goals for health, their goals for family, their goals for freedom, to experience the full American dream. Those were their motivations well beyond just gaining the vote. And often how they had to do that was to do it in a way that the segregated world allowed them to. And we'll talk more about some of the methods that they used and some of the achievements of some very amazing women. And so it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you all for being here. And I'll ask you if now, and maybe mention again later, to look into your family histories and see if there are any documents or diaries or anything that indicates that a member of your family may have been a suffragist. We here in Maryland, the Maryland Women's Heritage Center would love to know that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Savannah.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue. I want to echo the thanks to the Center Club and to you, Denise, for organizing this event. I also want to just say thank you so much to Jean and Martha for agreeing to participate in this event and for contributing to our project. So my name is Savannah Wood. I am the archives director for the 128-year-old Afro-American newspaper, which is based here in Baltimore, still operating to this day at afro.com and printing once a week. So you can become a member on our website. But this year, as the director of Afro Charities, which is the nonprofit partner to the Afro, we collaborated to create a book called To the Front, Black Women and the Vote. And this book is attempting to tell the story of some of the Black women suffragists here in Maryland specifically, but reaching out a little bit broader as well and uncovering some of their histories, because as Jean mentioned, a lot of those histories have been obscured. So in our attempt to do that, we called in a lot of different voices. Martha and Jean are both, they've both contributed to this project in different ways. And we also tried to connect this history to the present. And so there's a few articles in there as well that talk about some of the more modern day suffrage leaders, if you will, people who are still fighting for unfettered access to the vote, because this is an ongoing and evolving issue. But what Jean was saying is so interesting about digging into your family history is that I come to this work because the Afro is my family's newspaper. So it was founded by my great-great-grandfather, John H. Murphy, and behind me is his wife, Martha Murphy, who lent him the $200 to get the newspaper started. So for me, this project was really an interrogation into my own family history as well, and into the holdings that the Afro archives have within them. And so this resource is really a gem for pulling up different histories that might not be well known on a national scale. And so that was what we were attempting to do with our project, To the Front, Black Women and the Vote. So for that, I act as the editor and creative director for that project. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
And I'm so happy to have you all here. Thank you. So let's just start the discussion. And I was truly surprised when I was doing my research that there was a very separate movement, and that Black women actually didn't vote, you know, after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And what was surprising to me was that many of the leaders, the women, the white women who were leaders of the movement, were originally abolitionists. So they were against slavery. They supported the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted all men suffrage. They supported African-American men in their suffrage movement. What happened? What was the political and social environment like that was the kind of underpinning for the overall women's suffrage movement that led to this separation between, well, let's say exclusion of women of color from the overall suffrage movement? Can you give us a little bit of what was going on economically, politically, and socially? We know what was, it was the end of the Civil War and slavery, so we know what was going on politically, but socioeconomically, what was going on for women of color during this time?
Yeah, there you go. You take something, boy?
So who would like to start?
Gotta leave in there too.
I can
Yeah, that's in my black bag.
I can jump
Patricia
in.
White, do you mind muting Patricia?
Oh,
Thank you.
Okay. So Martha, would you like to address that?
Sure, I can jump in and at least provide some context. And I think, Denise, your question is one that we could ask of the early 19th century, we could ask of the early 20th century, we could ask of the early 21st century, is how is it that women's politics becomes divided, bifurcated? Where is our sisterhood in movements for women's political power, women's economic power, voting power, and more? I want to give an answer that really speaks to the ultimate shortcomings of the 19th Amendment, and that is that once by the end of the 1890s, as suffrage activists become together committed to winning a federal amendment to the Constitution, one that would mirror, parallel the 15th Amendment by now barring the states from using sex as a voting rights criteria. There are some extraordinary political hurdles, and we'll call them men, that are in the way. What do I mean by that? It means that in order for women to win the terms of a proposed amendment, they're going to have to secure the votes of members of Congress, men, and then that amendment will have to be approved by 36 states in order for it to become part of the Constitution. Again, votes that will be leveled by men. And most importantly for our conversation, Southern men Southern lawmakers will be part of these debates. And white women suffrage leaders develop what today we refer to as the Southern strategy. And that is a strategy that commits to including, winning the support of, and bringing on board white Southern women and their husbands and fathers and sons who are lawmakers. And in order to do so, the calculation goes, it's necessary to marginalize, to set to the side, to mute the interests, the talents, the contributions, and more of African American women. The bargain will be that lawmakers will approve the 19th Amendment with the understanding that the movement doesn't speak for African American women or to African American women's interests, and it will not interfere with the ability of the states to continue to disenfranchise African American women. Now, we might leave that story as one about unmitigated anti-Black racism, and that is a key facet of the story, but it is also a story about party politics, because this is being driven in large part by a Democratic Party, which at the beginning of the 20th century relies for its strength upon the disenfranchisement, the suppression of Black men's votes. And this is a party that fears the effect that Black women's votes might have in tipping the balance of power between the political parties, because Black women are expected to disproportionately, if not wholesale, register and vote for Republican Party candidates. So part of what is at stake in suppressing Black women's votes is the balance of power between the political parties and the strength of the then Democratic Party. And Democrats will go to extraordinary lengths to reassure themselves that Black women in those states where they should not will not get to the polls in 1920.
And I wanted to just add to that, that when I was doing research for this book, part of what I wanted to do was really pull out some articles from particular time periods throughout the Afro that illustrate this so that we have a sense of what was going on in Congress at the time. And in one of the articles, there's an explicit debate on the Senate floor that's saying, you know, it's not actually such a big deal if we let this amendment pass. We'll just do to Black women what we did to Black men, which was completely cut them out from the vote. How? Through, you know, through the poll taxes, through literacy tests, through outright intimidation and violence. And so this was already a game plan that they had used and it had worked against Black men. And so in looking at the 19th Amendment towards getting closer to 1920, I believe this article was written in 1918 that we're referencing in the book. That's when we see, okay, fine, we can make some, Congress is saying, okay, fine, we can make some concessions. Maybe we can let this go through, but we'll just plan to use the same game plan that we used against Black men to keep Black women from the vote as well. I also wanted to mention that when you were outlining the question, I think it's important to note for the whole conversation that we're kind of speaking in more general terms. Of course, at the 19th Amendment, some Black women were able to vote, but they were mostly in northern states. But throughout the South is where we see the majority of the suppression, which is not to say that there wasn't any in northern states. Of course, these are all sort of generalizations. Also, when we talk about the white women's suffrage movement and their support for the 15th Amendment, that's not necessarily true either. There are some quotes that we find where we see white women getting very upset that Black men should get the vote before them. And that's even published in a suffrage journal at the time. So there are just all of these instances of people feeling slighted, like they deserve to get the vote first, and really being vocal about that throughout history. So part of what my job was for this project is to find some of those source materials to represent what was going on during the time in our publication. Those are just two things that I wanted to note.
Do you mind if I add on?
Please.
Absolutely, Jean.
So one of the other pieces of context that it's important to remember is that in a number of cities in the South at this time, we're talking post-emancipation and working our way all the way up to 1920, there are many towns where the population of Black people is greater than the population of white people. This is left over from the plantation system. And there's very strong awareness, and newspaper after newspaper reported the fear that if Black women were given the vote, on top of the vote being given to Black men, that there would be a balance of power shift so great that Black women would tip the votes, that Black candidates would be elected to office, that segregation laws that were in place would be overturned. There was a very strong awareness of the demographics and of how much power the vote would have.
Which really just points to this fact that this suppression is a reaction to fear, like a fear of a loss of power, a fear of a loss of control. So we see that they recognize the power of Black women in politics, and we recognize the power of Black women in politics. And so this is where these suppression tactics come out of.
So given that these barriers were put up to suppress the vote, they weren't new, they were used against Black men as they were pursuing their right to vote as well. What was unique about the way that Black women approached these barriers? Was it unique? And what were some of the things that they did to overcome these barriers to getting out the vote? And I understand the outright intimidation with violence. We know what that was like, but the literacy test and the other obstacles that were placed in front of them, I think they were very unique in the way that they organized and came together to be able to prepare to register to vote. So what were some of the strategies that they were using? First of all, let's talk about how did they organize? How did they come together as a unit, a very dispersed unit of people across the United States? How did they come together and organize? and were able to execute these strategies? What were some of the things that went on?
You know, Black women have been organized for a very long time politically, whether it's through church conferences or women's clubs, through YWCAs, sororities, civil rights organizations, and more. And this network of Black women's political organizing is, you know, if you will, lit up by 1919 as it becomes increasingly clear that there will be a 19th Amendment, that there will be a shift for many American women at the polls. We see the sprouting up of suffrage schools and citizenship schools. This is a ground game. Black women are training one another. How do you pay it? What is a poll tax? How do you pay it? What is a literacy test? How do you pass it? On registration day, in so many places, Black women will turn out collectively in numbers that provide some modicum of safety and a way to resist intimidation and violence that surely is going to meet them. So we learned something about the fabric of Black women's political culture, which is in no way exclusive to suffrage associations, but runs through all kinds of civic and religious collectives that Black women have long been building and working through. And now they're going to be transformed in many places. I write about a city like Danville in Kentucky, another border state, where it is said every woman registered before the day was over. In St. Louis in Missouri, where the lines are long, and Black women endure ridicule and intimidation, but they're able to stay the course and get registered in the fall of 1920. But then there are examples of places, and I write about Daytona, Florida, home to the great educator and suffragist Mary McLeod Bethune, where Black women are beset upon by the Ku Klux Klan very deliberately to thwart the organizing work that had gone into bringing them to the fall of 1920. So we wind up with this very uneven terrain after the fall of 1920, but to the degree that many Black women, especially in southern states, do manage to register, do manage to cast ballots, is very much a product of this ground game and old networks that are being transformed now into, if you will, voter enforcement, voter education, to combat the voter suppression that is going to be so characteristic of this time. I was hoping maybe Jean would tell us something about Maryland, though.
Ellen, I would love to thank you to dovetail on that and say that we had a suffrage school right here in Baltimore, and an African-American suffrage club that was extremely effective. So let me take you back just quickly to 1915. In 1915, a woman named Estelle Hall Young starts a suffrage club on Druid Hill Avenue for her neighbors and herself and for the Black women on the west side of the city. Now, to know the context, you have to understand that at an earlier time period, there were middle class and upper class Black women and their families living in other parts of the city, but a segregation law was passed by the city, one of the first in the nation, that forced Blacks and whites to live separately. And they were pushed, the Black families were pushed over to Druid Hill Avenue. And if you moved onto a block that was predominantly white or too close to a block that was white, you could have rocks thrown through your windows and worse. It was a very tense time, but these were women who had achieved a level of education and were involved in business and civic pursuits. And they were involved in national organizations and those that were married, their husbands were also involved in national organizations that you would call early civil rights organizations. So Estelle Hall Young and her neighbors and friends and other women involved in civic pursuits formed the Progressive Women's Suffrage Club, also called the Colored Women's Suffrage Club. They held meetings in their homes and invited local and national speakers to Baltimore to come and talk to them. They were at times in contact with the white suffrage movement that had built up primarily centered around Charles Street in that area. They certainly were aware of each other. But the African American Suffrage Club was not invited to participate in the other group's parades, and they were not invited to come to hear their speakers, although sometimes they managed to. But most often they were working on their own, aware that their husbands and fathers, in some cases their sons, had the right to vote and might be able to influence the vote. And they wanted to make sure that their families were participating, their menfolk were participating in voting for the ratification of the 19th Amendment. One of the women, Augusta Chazelle, started a little school in the basement of the YWCA, and that is the colored YWCA, because those were segregated too. And every Thursday night, women could come to the Y and sit down and learn how to register to vote, what a ballot looked like, what the different political parties were, what the planks were that were going to be on the next election. They were not telling them specifically who to vote for. There's evidence of that. And Augusta Chazelle wrote a column, a primer for women voters that appeared in the Afro. And women would write questions to her, such as, why should women vote? And she would give them an answer from her heart about why women should vote and why it was important for Black women to vote. I was able to locate some records very recently that showed that after the 19th Amendment passed, in Baltimore, there was an election that year coming, and there would be, I believe, 7 days when women across the city, all women, could go to the precinct houses, which was a neighbor's house with a sign in the window, and you could register to vote. You would go in, they would ask you some questions, including questions that were embarrassing in 1920. You know, how old are you? They didn't, that was an offense to be asked that. But the women who had attended the suffrage school on Druid Hill Avenue showed up on the first two of the registration days to register for vote, and they showed up like an army. There are newspaper articles that describe it as a wave. Even the Baltimore Sun covered it. They sent reporters all over town to see which women, where in the city women were registering to vote and what it was like. And one of the stories in the Baltimore Sun said, in the African-American section of town, particularly on Druid Hill Avenue, it was shocking to them that the women seemed, I think he described them almost like robots. They came in, they knew all the answers, they knew what to write, they didn't ask questions, they didn't, you ask me my age, fine, here's my age, I don't care, here we go, let's do it. And their headlines in stories in the city's newspapers, in the Afro as well as in the Baltimore Sun and other newspapers, there were other papers then, that talk about in the first 2 days, some more than 2,000 Black women showed up at the polls to register. And the city was shocked, just shocked, because first of all, they didn't think any women had any interest in voting. That was an assumption. Second of all, they didn't believe that we were smart enough to get the job done. And they had no understanding or knowledge in general, other than the Afro, that the Black women had been training themselves for this moment and that they were going to take advantage of their American right. So it's really an achievement. And in the very first 2 days, the number of Black women who went out and registered. And that made it into the news coverage of the day.
Fantastic.
So Savannah, what in the archives of the Afro, I'm sure you had some very interesting stories and articles. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those or pick a few?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Jean mentioned the fact that Augusta Chazelle wrote this column for the Afro that appeared on a weekly basis, and I found that to be really fascinating. I also so as she said, there were some women who wrote in and said, why should I vote? That was a question. And she did actually make suggestions sometimes about who you should vote for if you care about Black causes, which I thought was also pretty interesting for the time. There were also just notices. I mean, there's so much of the history and how we understand how this community was operating is because of some of the notices that ran in the paper. So for instance, the meeting that Jean talks about at the YWCA, it occurred as an advertisement in the paper saying, come to the YWCA every Thursday. And there was someone who asked, well, how do I use the poll machine? And they said, well, you can go to this address and try it out before election day so you know how it works. So there was just the day-to-day communication is really well documented there. And that's what I find to be so fascinating. It's not even the huge landmark events that you could find in any newspaper, but really just the details about how this information was being transferred is what's really special about the Afro's coverage.
If I could just, Denise, I think it's really important to underscore how important newspapers like the Afro are to us in recovering this history, because in my research, I was disappointed more than once when I went to the state archives, to the official records, to ask the question, who voted? Did Black women vote? How many voted? What did the rolls look like? So much of that material was not valued, was not preserved. And so we really, in telling this history, particularly for Black women, rely upon African-American newspapers because they were so tuned in. And then newspapers like The Sun, who for another set of reasons are very tuned in, partly out of fear, but we get this vivid sense, and sometimes we get even the numbers and the nitty-gritty, right. But it's from the newspapers. People often ask me, so what percentages of this? And I say, listen, we didn't have exit polls in 1920, right? We didn't have the kind of mechanisms we have today for making, sort of big generalizations about who votes and how they vote. And the newspapers, without them, I think we would really be in a tough spot when it comes to telling the story. So thank you.
Absolutely.
One of the other, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If we think about who some of the founders and the leaders were on a national, let's say the influencers in the movement and how they emerged, can we talk about the profile of some of those women? Especially locally. I mean, I was the vice president of the YWCA of Greater Baltimore for a couple of years. So I knew about, there was a lot of provenance, and I knew about the suffrage schools, and I knew about the separate colored Y, and a lot of that was documented at the Y, and it was articles at the Afro, because Savannah, I believe one of your great grandmother was one of the founders.
This one
of the colored YWCA. So can we talk about that movement locally?
Yeah, I think the club movement is so critical, as Martha was pointing out too, as part of the ways in which Black women have been organizing for so long. And the way that we start to learn some of these more national names is through some of the national organizations. So for instance, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs merges actually two separate clubs at an annual meeting. And so this is a place where women from all over the country meet each other at annual conventions. Where women from Ohio and Florida and Maryland come together to discuss myriad topics of interest. So it's not just voting that's being discussed at these conventions, but also health and sanitation, child rearing, any number of topics might be discussed at these types of organization meetings. And Baltimore actually hosted the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in our city. I forget the date right now, but I think it was like 1914, 1916.
Okay.
So right after the Progressive Women's Suffrage Club was formed in Baltimore. So they would have been at that meeting represented and mixing with a wide group of women from all over the country and sharing ideas, sharing resources, and sharing tactics. So I think the club movement can't be overstated as a great meeting place, as conferences are today as well for academics and people in any field, really.
And I'd like to dovetail on that and say that so many of the women who we all think of as heroes, we think of them in isolation, almost like silos, where you think about Margaret Murray Washington, the wife of Booker T. Washington, who is a president of the National Colored Women's Clubs, is coming to Baltimore on a regular basis. There are many, many instances where she came to Baltimore. When this convention took place, you've got Madam C.J. Walker here in town speaking as a guest. You've got Mrs. Washington. You've got you name the hero from that time period, and they were all right here in Baltimore and urging others to organize. And at that meeting in 1916, they are looking at the example of the Baltimore Suffrage Club and other suffrage clubs that had formed in New York, in Chicago. Ida B. Wells' club was in Chicago. There was a very large Black suffrage, several organizations in New York City. And so they announced at that meeting, they endorsed the notion of women's suffrage, and they announced they invite women from all over the country to go back to their cities and to start suffrage clubs for Black women. So Baltimore is at the crossroads of a very huge movement. And I don't think we even understand yet just how important Baltimore was in that movement. But all of those greats came here. And we can even go back earlier, way earlier. If we go back to the first period of suffrage, when we're talking about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a suffragist. Some people feel that she was not as forceful as she could have been, but she was in her later years as this is all happening. And she spoke at the formation of the National Colored Women's Club meeting. And she urged the women on to keep moving toward unity and toward pooling their power to get the job done, to be able to get the vote. And she also maintained friendships with some of the white suffrage leaders, as did some others. There were also some very unusual periods in history, including in Maryland, where women voted before 1920. And one of the mysteries that I'm working on and that other researchers are working on is to discover more about the women who voted. There was an election in Annapolis in the year 1900 where women were permitted to vote. They were only allowed to vote on a municipal bond bill that would construct sidewalks in the city of Annapolis. The men had voted on it first and it didn't pass. They were cheap and they didn't want to spend the money. Well, who would want sidewalks? Women who wear floor-length dresses all day. The leaders of the town knew it. And they organized as a group, and then they went to the state legislature and received approval to have a municipal bond bill election, a special election, and to allow the women to vote. And many people don't know this, but there was a Black woman among them. Only women who owned property were allowed to vote. And there was a Black woman who was a property owner who did. And she may well be the first Black woman to vote in the state of Maryland. So again, as Martha noted, finding the records to document that is very difficult. But it was such an important thing that later you've got Ms. Cat and other of the women who recorded for NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They make note of Maryland's role in this early vote, and it's documented in their records. They also documented women voting in Arundel on the Bay, which was at the time like a little corporate town down by Annapolis, and women voting in, registering to vote in Still Pond. And there were two other Black women that we know about. We know that they registered to vote in about 1906 or 1909. We don't know if they actually voted because no one has maintained, or we cannot find the record. But the record of the newspapers at the time say, because it was so outrageously unusual, that 2 Black women showed up to register. Nobody bothered to write their names in any of the newspaper stories. And but one day we're going to dig that up, and we're going to find that and be able to identify them and learn about their families. And what a day that'll be.
Martha, we know that that suffrage for women was just not a domestic issue, it was global. So if the global movement, did it mirror the domestic movement, or did it evolve as a unit for all women, regardless of color, when we think outside of the United States? Do you have any evidence of that, or any knowledge of that?
I can say a little bit about that. And there's a wonderful book by historian Catherine Marino that has compared women's suffrage movements across the Americas and puts the US in that historical context. So I recommend Catherine Marino's book. But you know, Black suffragists are, particularly leaders like Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Mary McLeod Bethune, always have an internationalist vision for their work. They are always working through an internationalist framework. And that means that they will personally travel to the UK, travel to Europe, be part of international women's congresses that link their interests and their causes to women, at least across some parts of the globe, importantly. And I think for Black suffragists, this is especially important in a period that they are enduring the rebuff and worse within a domestic suffrage movement. It is a affirmation of their status and standing and interests, and another way to build important networks that will continue to animate Black women's suffrage claims even through the modern civil rights era. So I think this internationalist perspective and field in which Black women work is critical. You know, at the same time, I think that Black women are reluctant, some of them, and Margaret Murray Washington comes immediately to mind, are reluctant to be too closely associated with some of the more radical women's suffrage movements and tactics, particularly those that come out of the UK. The women who are associated and come of age in the Pankhurst faction of the British women's movement for women's votes, including Alice Paul. For Washington, that is that is not a road that she's going to recommend that women in the National Association of Color Women go down. She really warns against participating in Paul's 1913 parade, for example, in Washington, is not going to endorse Black women's participation later on in the picketing of the White House. And I think we understand that Washington is not a radical suffragist. She's prepared to be ready when women get the vote, but she's not prepared to put Black women's reputations and their lives at risk, frankly, I think at risk in by drawing them into the, the very forceful but very risky and very radical confrontations that Alice Paul is associated with because of her work in Britain, and she ultimately will bring to the UK. I think Alice Paul, and her associates provoke their own arrest ultimately in Washington after a long season, an arduous season of picketing at the White House. This for Paul is political theater. This is the way to get women's votes onto the agenda of the Wilson administration and personally onto the president's agenda. Black women in Washington, D.C. do not need to stage political protest, to be harassed by police, to be jailed unreasonably and without cause in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, that is part of Black women's everyday experience in a city like Washington. And so I think for Mrs. Washington and others, this presents a kind of tension with at least some factions that inform the US movement that have their origins in Britain.
And I would add to that also that for many of the Black women involved in suffrage in this time period, from say 1900 to 1920, literacy and education are really touchstones. One of the most active organizations was not a suffrage group per se, but it was originally formed. It was politely called itself a literary society, and that's the Du Bois Circle, which started here in Baltimore and still exists today. They've been going on since 1906 and still meets. And the women of the Du Bois Circle were primarily educated. They were primarily involved in many of the important civic organizations. They were leaders of the Women's Civic Cooperative Club movement. They were involved in wartime activities where women could take a role in leadership on the home front. They were involved in education. They were educating themselves and others. They had a topic every week and they would bring in a professor from different colleges to speak to them about the international and the local issues of the day. So they were very aware of what was going on around the world. And they were very aware of what was happening here, and they were looking for ways to have an impact and do well for the community. And they knew, and I think, Martha, I think maybe you can confirm for me, in many cities where you find a Black literary society, they were talking about a lot more than books. Mm-hmm. That was how it looked polite, so that no one would be concerned about what they might be talking about. So their advertisements were for a literary society, but they might be actually working on the vote. And we saw some of that here. Sometimes they received funding in certain places in the country. Sometimes they received funding from suffrage supporters that were in Europe some of the money that supported them came from other places where they were not going to be able to raise a lot of money here for their activities. They had other kinds of stunts that they were involved in, though. I don't want it to seem like they were, completely shy of that. And one wonderful Maryland story is about a group of Black women near Laurel, Maryland. There was right before the big 1913 parade in Washington, which took place at the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. There was a group of women, white women, who marched from New York all the way down to Washington, D.C. They were to carry a letter and word to Wilson of the women's desire for the vote. And as they came through Maryland, the newspaper reporter started asking them, what are you going to do about those Black women? What if they want to join the march with you? Because in every state, women would tag along and join in and walk for a few miles or walk through the state and then drop out. And they really didn't have a lot of encounters, according to all the documentation, until they got to Maryland, when Black women started showing up and trying to join the marchers as they walked through the state on their way to Washington, D.C. And they were flabbergasted, the original group of marchers. They didn't want to get involved in the politics. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to be afraid. Some of the marchers threatened to drop out of the march if Black women should be in the march with them. They wanted to get rid of them. And there are a couple of really fascinating documents that showed that when the marchers, they got all the way from New Jersey, New York, and they were in Laurel, Maryland, and sort of out of nowhere, some stories say 20 to 50, some stories say 100, Black women came out in carriages and on foot and met the marchers on the road. And the Black women had made signs and were wearing buttons that said, "Votes for colored women." And they wanted to tag along with the marchers the rest of the way to Washington. And so there was this moment of, I think, big realization that Black women were serious about the vote, and that they wanted to be part of this. Talk about a publicity stunt. If the reporters who walked all the way with this group from New Jersey were called war correspondents. So when they get to Maryland, there's this moment when they're like, what do we do? Do we let them come with us or not? And ultimately they were told that they could not. The Black women were told that they could not. So they waited and they let the women pass, and then they followed them for a bit down the road to make their point, and then they turned back and went home. But so far, we at the Women's Heritage Center, we have not been able to find the names of those women. Somewhere there must be a document or some family record, or someone knows somewhere who were the Black women who organized that. We believe we have some clues about what churches may have sent delegations to join the march and to be part of that march. But it's a really telling thing that Maryland is where that happened. We went all the way from New York, and it was Maryland where Black women showed up and tried to be part of the march.
I think it's telling that throughout this discussion, we haven't said anything about the Black men. Where were the Black men throughout all this movement? Who were the supporters for the Black suffragists, the Black men who were supporting them? And
they were here.
What type of support did they give? I guess that's the question. What type of support did they give?
Savannah can talk a little bit about the debates that went on in the Afro. There were supporters, just as with white men, there were some who were for and some who were against. And that plays out in the press and letters to the editor. But in Maryland, for the women on Druid Hill Avenue, there was a group of Black men, educators, professors from Morgan and professors from Howard, Some of them were family members. One of the women who has a big role in women's suffrage in Baltimore was Margaret Gregory Hawkins. She was the wife of the principal of the Black high school. I mean, at that time, there's one major Black high school where students from here to Virginia would come here to go to that school, and her husband was the principal. And he was a supporter. And her family goes all the way back to Frederick Douglass and its relationships. The Gregory family had connections to, I think her grandfather wrote a biography of Frederick Douglass, and they were suffrage supporters. And so they brought professors to Baltimore to speak at the Du Bois Circle, to speak at the Suffrage Club meetings and at others. It's significant to note also that the Du Bois Circle is named for W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was pro-women's suffrage. He was for women's suffrage, and he devoted, I think, 2 issues of the Crisis, the NAACP's magazine, to the topic of women's suffrage. He invited Mary Church Terrell and others to write about women's suffrage in that magazine. So there were supporters. Booker T. Washington, not so much. He was more interested in labor issues and in training skills. And, when we look back now, we have to ask, did we need them all? Do we need all those viewpoints to get up the road and to get to the progress? But there were certainly debates. There were certainly debates, and in both the Sun, the Evening Sun, the Commercial, which was, I think, the News American, and other newspapers, we have seen articles where the male writers mocked all women who wanted to vote. They mocked white women. The Sun mocked all women who wanted to vote. And one of the articles about women registering to vote, the Sun spent a whole lot of time talking about what they wore to go register to vote. And why would they, questioning who was watching the children? Who was watching the children while they were registering to vote? And so the times they were in are very, very telling in these articles.
Martha, did you had something to add?
Yeah, I think that what Jean has said is so important. And I think the only thing I'd add is that, in some cities, African-American men also show up to the suffrage schools. That women's activism, women's organizing, the principles, the tactics, in many ways apply equally, right, to the possibility of Black men getting into the polls. And I found that fascinating, that 1920 becomes an interesting kind of opportunity for, in a sense, revivifying in some localities Black men's drive to also come back to the polls after a long period of violence. And so it's hard to know how to characterize those men, right? Are they women's suffragists? Are they something else? But it's a reminder, right, that I think for Black folks, men and women, right, these are stories and experiences and politics that are very embroiled. And it's difficult, I think, for anyone to avoid, right, the question of women's votes, because it is so much bound up with that. And on the other hand, there are places like the state of Georgia that has to amend its poll tax laws to include women, because the law was written to say, each or all or every man must. And so Black women come, you know, into special focus and become, in a twisted way, equal to their male counterparts.
And there was a men's suffrage league in Maryland and in Baltimore. They had a chapter in Annapolis on the men's. These were primarily white, probably all white men's suffrage clubs that aligned themselves with the Just Government League, which was became the major Maryland suffrage club, 14,000 strong by its later years, and merged to help form the League of Women Voters after the vote was gained, right? But men's suffrage clubs would march in the marches, and they would march as a unit together. You know, so many of them were husbands of the suffragists, but many of them were not. There were quite a few lawyers and doctors and educators among them as well. And there were what women who were suffragists called the anti-suffragists. They were called aunties, kind of like a joke. You know, the aunties would have their own meetings. They had their own headquarters. They had their own events, and they would have debates. There were very public debates that would take place where the aunties would send a representative and the suffragists would send a representative, and they would debate in a civilized way, in a very sort of organized manner, and sometimes the newspapers would publish arguments from both sides. So it's not like today where you put in something on Twitter and you get in the trolls and the spam, you know, hits you and you get flamed. They were much more civilized about the way that they held these events. And I should note that there are a few reports of Black women who were able to pass as white, infiltrating some of the white suffrage clubs. And that's not terribly well documented, and you can imagine why, because there are lots of people who didn't want anyone to know that that was happening. But there are remarks in the record of suffrage leaders about not understanding how it was that Black women seemed to know what they were doing over there. And it's in some cases because they'd been infiltrated.
Is that, Jean, if I can, is that like espionage? In other words, are Black women sort of trying to gather intelligence? Do they want to be wholesale included and pass into white women's politics?
Well, there's some of both in a very interesting way. In some of the early years of suffrage organizations in Maryland, there were several, some of them were more open to Black participation in the early years, before we get to the point of a battle over a constitutional amendment. And so there were some Black women, for example, who were members of the Equal Suffrage League, which was, there was in fact a rift, a split among suffrage organizations in Maryland, where those who were open to people of color went one way and those who were not went another way. And some of the women who had become active in the larger groups and felt cast out, some of them chose to stay involved and some of them chose to move over to the All Black Club. But there, occasionally we run across a reference to someone having gone to the meeting, gone to a meeting or gone to a guest speech. Emmeline Pankhurst from England, a big suffragist, spoke at the Lyric here. The Lyric was a big location for those kinds of things. And we think that there were a few Black women who went to that, who came back and reported on what they heard. Documenting that is really hard, really hard. Not only because nobody kept the papers or the papers were lost along the way, but also because they needed to protect themselves if they were going to do something like that. It's kind of an open question that there's a lot that we want to know that we don't know. Also, you may have noticed it's very difficult going back into old records to find the women because they're all listed under their husband's names. So even the director of the president of the Just Government League, which was the largest of the suffrage clubs in Maryland, that was predominantly white. She's Mrs. Donald Hooker. You know, if you go back into clippings and you're trying to find references to her, you don't look for Edith. You don't. You have to look for her by her husband. And that slows us down as women's historians.
Yeah.
But even more so with Black women, the newspapers themselves often didn't bother to say the names. They didn't feel it was important to name the Black women who were achieving or striving. So we don't even have names.
On the question of men within the women's suffrage movement, I just wanted to follow up on what Jean said earlier. In the book that we put together, there is a short section that's called Men and the Women's Suffrage Movement that just highlights a few articles from the Afro to kind of underscore some of the varying attitudes toward the women's suffrage movement. And you know, in the for category, there's just people who are wholesale for it. Yes, it's a good idea. Women should have the vote. Why not? There's some men who recognize that the same arguments that are being used against women's suffrage are the exact same arguments that were used against Black men getting the vote. And so they see this as an obvious choice that women should be able to get the vote as well. There's other men who write in and they say, Black women should get the vote because they'll vote in our best interest. So it's still about the Black man, but it's, you know, in support because it's going to support me. And then the people who are against it, who wrote into our paper, primarily it's just general patriarchy. Women should be at home. We don't need to have their voice. There's a piece that's included that's about Dean Lucy Slow, who was in Baltimore for a very long time, was a teacher here, moved to DC, and became Dean of Women at Howard University. But before she did all that, she was working with the NAACP here in Baltimore. And one of the articles writes about a speech that she gave and says, well, now that she's spoken, you know, the vote for Black women is assured, so poor men won't even be able to go to the voting booth by themselves. It's just, you know, it's just trying to get a joke in at the end. So the range of attitudes is really all across the board. It just depends on where you're looking.
Thank you so much. And are there any other significant stories that emerged as you were doing your research that we had? Of course, we know we don't hear this narrative that you think we should know about.
You asked a question
that we haven't
earlier
touched on
about Black women who were leaders on a national level, or voices on a national level, who were specifically from Maryland. I just want to say Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's name. She's a very early suffragist who was born free in Baltimore. And I think that's a really important point also. She was born, I believe, in 1825. And it's really important to note that Maryland and Baltimore had one of the largest populations of free Black people before the end of the Civil War. I think that's a really extraordinary foundational fact for understanding the way that how we came to be in Maryland and how our politics evolve over time, understanding that we have one of the longest legacies of being free in this country. It's right here in Maryland. But I wanted to mention her because she is an educator at a time. She is a really well-known poet and uses her writing in service of abolition movements and in service of the suffrage movement. In 1866, she's invited to speak in New York at a suffrage convention that's happening, that's primarily organized by white women. And she is really unapologetic in her critique of the way that white women are not representing Black women's interests in their movement. So I just want to make sure that we bring her up and have her represented in this conversation, because she's really a leading voice that is so important for our local history as well.
Thank you, Savannah. So I have one last question for you. If everyone would take about 5 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A. It's not a question, but a comment. But how, history has a purpose. And for me, or as I understand it, history is a way for us to understand where we've been to inform where we should go. So if you don't know where you've been, it's going to be very difficult to chart a path to where you should go. So how does this history inform us today as we all consider going to the polls in November, as we all consider exercising this hard-fought right to vote? What does it tell today, and why should we be listening? What are the clues? I mean, for me, it's obvious that, it for everyone, that particularly for women, that blood was shed for us to win this right to vote. It's our right. It's our constitutional right, and we shouldn't take it lightly. So sometimes it's very difficult in all the noise and distraction to remember that. So what would be the takeaway? How would you frame this for today's voter?
I have kind of two paraphrased quotes that I'll share.
Okay.
They're going to be paraphrased, so take that with a grain of salt, and you can maybe look it up later. But going back to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, in that speech that I was mentioning, one of the most famous lines that comes out of it is that we're all bound up together in this great bundle of humanity. We can't trample on the weakest among us and expect to move forward that way. And so really considering not just the people who are like you, but people who have less access than you, and making sure that whatever movements you're involved in include them and their best interests. So that's one thing that I want to put on the table. And the second is a paraphrased Ida B. Wells, which is that basically freedom requires eternal vigilance. And that just because they had the victory with the 19th Amendment to some degree, that didn't mean that the fight was over. And so when we talk about elections, yes, those are markers for time, basically, and markers of how public opinion is shifting, more or less, but it's never only about the election. It's always about the ongoing political work. So those are two paraphrased quotes. And then the third thing that I just wanted to mention is what I found so fascinating in doing this research for this project in particular were the ways in which Black women were organizing around self-education, and how that's such a critical piece of how we shift culture, is by maintaining community with people around intellectual pursuits and around understanding an issue better and knowing from that study how to act.
Thank you, Savannah.
I'll add that, part of what I think I learned from Black women in 1920 is that exercising a right to vote is very much about a ground game in any given election cycle. Those suffrage schools, right, are that self-education, as Savannah put it, is critical and is part of the work, especially like in 1920, I would say as in 2020, when the rules of the game are changing quickly in real time on the ground. We have to be sort of super educated, but super engaged. The other lesson is about the history of voter suppression in this country, and a recognition that our history is far more characterized by the suppression of votes than it is by and a commitment to universal voting rights. That perhaps there was a heyday in this country somewhere between the passage of the Voting Rights Act and its gutting in 2013 by the Supreme Court, where, you know, Americans really could begin to think that we were living in a regime that honored universal suffrage. But that is not the case in 2020. And so when that work seems arduous, it's because it is, because it's very baked in to our political culture, that some Americans can, will, and should be kept from the polls by law, by violence, by intimidation, by subterfuge, and more. And when we struggle in our own community, you know, we're in Baltimore. I just got my mail-in ballot request and sent it back this morning. But I'm someone whose vote almost didn't count in June because I didn't know that you have to sign the outside of the envelope before that mail-in ballot will be counted. And by sheer chance, a friend let me know about that. So that's all to say that all those things go to suppressing our votes, to keeping us from the polls. And this is going to be a complex and challenging voting season for many reasons, including the persistence of the coronavirus. We're going to be asked to risk our health in order to exercise a fundamental right. So two little changes, but I also am very inspired by the women in Vanguard and the others that we've heard about tonight, and their willingness to confront those challenges a long time ago.
And I would agree with both Savannah and Martha, you know, that Ida B. Wells quote is one of my favorites. I think it is eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
Mm.
And if you can create the right to vote by legislation, you can also take it away.
Mm.
And that we have, what we have to learn, one of the things we have to learn and take away from this, you know, multi-decade effort on the part of women to get a piece of the American dream, to be truly free, to be heard, and to use our collective power. I think one of the things that I just urge everyone to remember is that it's one thing to get the right, it's another thing to use it. And that the women, Black and white and other, we could tell stories about women of other groups and how they may or may have been prevented from voting. But for all of us, the importance of defining voting power as an American right to which we are entitled was worth fighting for in the year 1900. It was worth fighting for in 1840. It is worth fighting for today. And that's one thing that I take away from it. The other thing that I think is really important is that inspiration, the stories. And if you don't know a lot about Maryland's women who were active in suffrage, there's a new podcast series. Several of us were part of making it. It's called Ballot and Beyond. It's at ballotandbeyond.org, and it's the podcast series is funded by the Maryland Historical Trust and put together, produced by Preservation Maryland. We just taped 28 podcasts, each one telling the story of a Maryland suffragist, and fascinating, inspiring women. Get to know them. Get to know them. You will really be amazed at the breadth of their backgrounds, from housewives to teachers to nurses to many firsts in history, and women you thought you knew about. Clara Barton. I mean, I thought, as a fifth grader, I had read everything that, I knew about Clara Barton. Clara Barton was a suffragist. Harriet Tubman, people don't think of her work in suffrage. They think of her as, as the Moses of the Underground Railroad, but she was a suffragist and fought for equal pay as well. And I just, I encourage you to learn. And again, as I said at the beginning, I encourage you to look into your own history. You may be surprised. You may find out that your relatives were anti-suffrage, and you may find out that they were active in suffrage. Martha recently went on a journey she wrote about for the New York Times, trying to find her ancestors and whether or not they were able to vote. And it's a wonderful search. And it means so much to us because we stand on their shoulders. And we learn from them.
Thank you. And this has been so informative. I thank you so much for your time and for, your knowledge and just the insight and energy you bring to the conversation. Personally, for me, it really has strengthened my resolve. And, sometimes the noise, just external noise, leads to apathy, but it really does strengthen your resolve and has helped me overcome my apathy. So I thank you so much. So we'll go into the Q&A. If you do have a question, Nancy, are you there? Are you handling the Q&A, or are we submitting by chat? I don't know. Okay, so if you submit your questions through the chat, and I will, and you can submit them now.
There's a question in the chat about were any particular local churches supportive of the suffrage effort?
Yes.
You want to take that, Jean?
Sure.
Yes,
many of the churches were. One is Union Baptist, which still exists on Druid Hill Avenue. The Suffrage Club met there. Also the Du Bois Circle met there. There were a number of women's organizations that used that church. And it's worth noting that the wife of one of the early pastors there was the only representative from Maryland to attend the founding of the National Colored Women's Club. In the records, in the minutes of those meetings, which were preserved in Ida B. Wells' notes, it stated which women represented which state. And Union Baptist Church had a representative there. She represented herself. She didn't list herself as being there for any particular clubs, because that was before any of our clubs were formed here. But she definitely was there and in the meeting. She paid her dues. I think it was 50 cents. It was a lot of money back then. And so we can know that she brought that inspiration and that word back to Baltimore. And that's a place where we might be able to start. And many other Black churches in the city were also actively involved. Many of the wives of pastors were leaders in civic organizations and in suffrage.
Okay, do we have any other questions? And I think there was a question previously about why was the white suffragist, why were the white suffragists, who were also very, well, abolitionists, I think we touched on this, who are also abolitionists, so opposed to women of color voting?
I'll I'll take a shot. I think that it's important to say that while it might not sort of ring true with our 21st century way of thinking, there was nothing about being an abolitionist that necessarily made you an anti-racist in the 19th century United States, which is to say that for many abolitionists, the cause of the slave was important, but an abstraction, and did not account for who formerly enslaved people would be in a post-abolition world. So it's an important question to ask about abolitionist individuals and the agenda in any given abolitionist society or organization. To what degree were they also subscribers to what in 21st century parlance we would call anti-racism. So I think that's a place to begin. And I think that the politics, women's politics, the prospect of Black and white women coming together politically tests and reveals deeply held ideas about inequality, deeply held racism in some cases, which is to say, I don't think it was a predictable or a given that those tensions would exist, but they are revealed vividly sometimes when we have instances when Black and white women, perhaps for the very first time, are coming together to work politically around anti-slavery and around women's rights. So I think that's at least a way to set the stage for how it is that the abolitionist roots for white women in their campaign for rights and ultimately for the vote doesn't necessarily lead down a path to racial equality or anti-racism. White women will be tested. They will be offered, if you will, the opportunity many times over to not only confront their own personal feelings, but to confront the politics of anti-Black racism. And many of them will be seduced by the prospect of how effective anti-Black racism can be in organizing politics in the 19th and the 20th century.
And I think that's right for context. And I would also add that even in the years leading up to emancipation and immediately after, there is a very strong sense of the moral importance of emancipating the slaves. And many of the abolitionists would, on moral grounds, object to people being held as property. That does not equate with saying, after we free people, we want to live next door to them. We want our sons to marry their daughters. That's very different in that time period. It's almost compartmentalizing when we look back at the record of, and many of you know that, there were efforts to ship Blacks back to Africa. And, it's one thing to say morally, we want to end slavery. It's another thing to say we want to live side by side as equals.
I have a question from Lachelle Little, and she says, as the country progressed, what happened to the suffrage groups, and did they evolve into other groups?
Yes. Yes. In Maryland, many of the suffrage groups evolved to become the League of Women Voters. And in fascinating ways, remember there's no internet, and there's, early on there's certainly no cell phones, but in many cases, there are no phones. And but there were newspapers, people had printing presses, and a number of women gained their career skills, honed their skills really in the suffragist movement and in their political activism. And they go on to take other careers. Several of the Baltimore suffragists, both Black and white, move into social work, education, social justice. There's a direct line from the suffragist movement into organizations forming, also in labor, because there were, from the North on down, women who worked in factory, unmarried women who had, who were the working women of the time period. When women received the vote with the 19th Amendment, around that same time, there were labor reforms and efforts to ensure that women who were members of unions could vote, because many of the unions would not let women vote. Many of the churches, not Black churches, and Martha can speak to that, Black churches, many of them very early on allowed women to vote. But there's this whole self-determination movement and reform that's going on, and suffrage clubs, many of them morphed into other kinds of activities, political clubs included. Women women joined the political parties and led political clubs as well. So what they learned as suffragists became the basis for support for the Equal Rights Amendment, for support for protections on the job, for equal pay, for other kinds of products.
Thank you. Louise Svent asked, what is the relationship, if any, the work of the suffrage and the work to change to end redlining, which is the geographical boundary around Baltimore City where Blacks were prohibited from moving? I say until the 1960s, but I would argue that it continued well past the 1960s. Was there any relationship there between the work of the suffragists and the work to eliminate redlining in Baltimore City?
There is some, and it's a very good question. What we know is that the same women who were organizing suffrage clubs were also organizing to protect their families and to make opportunities to break down the Jim Crow laws and to break down the laws of segregation. And this started, and their training in this started well before they started the suffrage club. One of the reasons they wanted the vote was because they knew that if they could combine their power, that they might be able to overturn the law. And in fact, W.E.B. Du Bois at one point invites Black women to get involved in protecting the ability of men to vote so that they can fight segregation. Excuse me.
Thank you, Jean. And we have time for one final question. It's from Byron Deese. And Byron says it was mentioned earlier that Baltimore had the largest, I believe it was Maryland, maybe Savannah, you referenced that, had the largest population of freed slaves prior to emancipation. Are they examples of Baltimore playing a progressive role for the plight of Black Americans post-emancipation?
I'll just jump
I'm
in.
not sure you had that fact correct.
I wrote a whole book about this. It's
Right.
called Birthright Citizens. And it is about the role that Black Baltimoreans play in the decades before the Civil War and into the Civil War era in transforming the US Constitution, and particularly the 14th Amendment that transforms formerly enslaved people and free Black people into citizens. So I'll just give a small plug for Birthright Citizens. It's a long and I hope interesting look at that very question.
Okay, thank you so much, Martha. So that brings us to the end of our discussion or conversation. Again, I would like to thank Martha Jones, Dr. Martha Jones, Jean Thompson, and Savannah Wood for their participation and for sharing and just enlightening our audience and informing them. This was very, very helpful. And please visit the websites. Dr. Jones's book was released yesterday. It was on the market yesterday, so you can purchase her book, Vanguard, and also Savannah Wood's publication is available for download. And I believe the link is on the invitation that went out. If not, Savannah, could you post it in the chat?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And thank you again, Jean. Love your stories. Any final words? Still got 4 minutes.
Everybody
Can I
get
just
my
say
Vanguard.
Can I just say you all did a great job of listing constantly while we were listening. You were putting up lots of different resources, and I will try to collect those and get those out to everybody because there's a lot of links, and this was tremendous. Thank you all.
I'd like to thank our audience.
Yeah, thank you all. It's really great.
Thank the Center Club for allowing us to host this event. And we look forward to seeing you in person one day soon. Actually, next week. So remember that, please register with Nancy if you like to show up in person at the club. It's going to be a limited event. And we continue to try to bring you content, events to add value to your membership, even post coronavirus. So be safe, be well, and thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Take care, everyone.